Netcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is Twit.
Bandwidth for Triangulation is brought to you by Cashfly at CACHEFLY.com.
This is Triangulation, episode number 332, February 2nd, 2018. Dorcas Cheng-Tozun. This episode of Triangulation is brought to you by LegalZoom. Get your dream business up and running and take control of your family's future with LegalZoom. For special savings, visit LegalZoom.com and enter the code Triangulation at checkout. And by FreshBooks, the easy-to-use cloud accounting software for small business owners. Make this year your most productive year yet. Try it for free for 30 days at freshbooks.com/triangulation. Hello and welcome to Triangulation. This is the show where we bring the luminaries, the visionaries, the people who understand tech into the studio here at Twit and give you their viewpoints. I'm Father Robert Ballecer, the digital Jesuit, and I am so honored to be joined by a person who I think can give us a fresh perspective on the Silicon Valley and the startup culture. We welcome to the show Dorcas Cheng-Tozun. She is the author of Start, Love, Repeat. That's how to stay in love with your entrepreneur in a crazy startup world. Dorcas, thank you very much for joining us for Triangulation.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm so glad to be here.
Now, you are a Bay Area woman. You were schooled in Stanford. You took a BA in communications and an MA in sociology. What brings you into the startup world?
My husband, actually.
Yes.
So I had no interest in the startup world. I studied sociology, as you mentioned, and so my background is actually in the nonprofit sector. So I worked in nonprofits for about a decade, loved doing community development work, doing social services. And then there was a man who I fell in love with when we were in college together. And he really could not figure out what he wanted to do in college. And it worried me a little bit because he kept changing his major every quarter. And I thought that there was something wrong with him, that he couldn't focus on anything. And then it turned out that he was an entrepreneur, which meant that he is interested in everything and he wants to have the opportunity to try everything. And so then when we graduated, he actually did have a normal job, a normal 9-to-5 job for about 6 months. And then he hated it, so he quit and then started his first business. And now he's on business, I think, number 4, but this is the biggest one yet. And as the spouse of somebody who does this, I can't help but totally be pulled into it.
You know, it's interesting that you bring up the fact that he couldn't choose a major, because now that I think of it, there's probably no better analogy to what a serial startup person is like. They get bored very easily. They love the excitement. They love the action, and they want to create things, but then they also want to move on. Is that what you're seeing with the serial startup phenomenon in the Silicon Valley?
Oh, absolutely. There is this restlessness that I think is just inherent to entrepreneurs, and they love that startup phase. And then as soon as the business gets a little bit more settled, a little bit more stable, then they just want to move on and they want to create something from scratch. I think that is really what gives them a sense of purpose. And so that's why they just keep doing it over and over again. But unfortunately, that also makes it difficult for people who are in relationships with entrepreneurs. So I spoke with one psychologist who phrased it really well. He said that entrepreneurs are so fun to date because they're really interesting, really exciting. They love to do new activities and have so many adventures, but they're difficult to marry because their desire to always be seeking something new and seeking adventure, it comes into direct tension and conflict with the ideals of marriage, of being stable and committed and staying with the same person for a very long time.
And that's exactly what your book is all about. It's about how to have a sane relationship with a serial startup entrepreneur. It's about how to carve a space out for yourself when you're dealing with the startup culture here in the Silicon Valley. But of course, before we get into that, I want to talk a little bit about you, because you've got a very interesting background. As you mentioned, you've got more than a decade of working with nonprofits. You have lived all around the world. You've been in Kenya, you've been in Hong Kong, you've been in China. So you've seen how this kind of culture, this technology culture, the nonprofit culture works in different parts of the world. Is there something unique about the startup culture in the Silicon Valley, do you think?
Oh, yeah. I think that the startup culture is extending to different parts of the world, which is actually really exciting to see. But in Silicon Valley, it continues to be in hyperdrive. I think the level of intensity, the aspirations that people have here, they're tremendous. You know, you can't really walk 20 feet without running into an entrepreneur who not only wants to start a business, but wants to start a business that changes the entire world. And I think entrepreneurs in other countries, although they are starting to catch up with us, may have more modest aspirations to begin with. You know, they really want to support their family. They want to start something that serves their community. But in Silicon Valley, it's everything times 10. You know, everyone just wants bigger and faster and more exciting and newer.
Let's talk about that phenomenon a little bit, because I was born, like you, in the Silicon Valley. I am a Silicon Valley boy. I lived a lot of my life here. I started a business when I was very young. And so I'm an entrepreneur. I'm a startup guy, but an entrepreneur and a startup guy back in the 80s is not an entrepreneur and a startup guy today. Back then, I did a lot of research, found the business I wanted to be in, had a passion for it, and then I went through several hard years building it up. You would not see that today. Today, we use terms like a hard pivot, and this idea that an idea, you throw it out, and if it doesn't get traction immediately, you kill it and you move on.
Yes.
That's the serial entrepreneur philosophy. How do we get to that point? I mean, why is that the new way of being an entrepreneur?
I think that it is all of us trying to keep up with technology, and everything has moved faster, and we know about what's going on around us more comprehensively and at a more rapid rate. And so there is this increasing pressure of, I just have to keep up. And if I'm going to keep up, I can't stick with this idea. Even if it's something that I love, if it doesn't work within a few months, then I need to move on and I need to find something else that works. And you see so many other people around you doing that same thing. And so it's really difficult to stick on one path and just continue on that way if you don't see it gaining traction at a very fast rate. And I think, you know, there's pressure from investors, there's pressure from competitors, and so entrepreneurs just feel like they just got to keep going, and there's no time to stop and rest and do research.
What I like about your story is you are covering part of the narrative that often gets lost. That with the high stakes game of the Silicon Valley serial entrepreneur, with moving from company to company, somewhere along the line, you have to live. Somewhere along the line, you have to build up relationships. That's specifically what you try to cover. And reading your book, it was interesting because you brought up a lot of points that I think are obvious, but not obvious. It's like, well, of course that would happen, but I just never thought about it. Well, would you be willing to dive into the book in just a second? Let's go through some of the main tenets of your story and see if they resonate with our audience. Would that be okay with you?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to share more.
And we're going to get to that in just a bit. First of all, I do want to take a very short break to thank a sponsor of this episode of Triangulation. Now, folks, 2018 is here. I don't know if you know it, but we are in the new year. So the question is, what are you doing to prepare yourself for your story, for your narrative? Are you doing the things that you need to do? Are you connecting with the people that you need to connect with? Are you adding the resources to make sure that you are ready for 2018? Well, I hope so. And that's why we're so happy to have LegalZoom as a sponsor of this episode of Triangulation. Now, LegalZoom can help you make this year the year you finally get serious about launching and running your own business. Talk about serial entrepreneurship. Talk about being a startup person. The first step is to make sure that you are covered legally. Now, as a matter of fact, LegalZoom has been helping people just like you take care of their dreams and responsibilities for more than 16 years. A white glove service for business owners, everything you need to run your business so you don't have to worry about compliance or when things are due. They'll guide you through the process, through the pitfalls. They'll make sure that you avoid the mistakes that everyone else makes. Their services include tax consultation, intellectual property, payroll, employee handbooks, and business compliance. Now, LegalZoom is not a law firm, but they have the resources to keep you on the right path, including advice from their nationwide network of independent attorneys, all at your fingertips. LegalZoom can help you rest a little easier, knowing that your family's future is squared away with the right estate plan. Whether you want to take your business to the next level or take control of your family's future with an estate plan, LegalZoom plugs right into your life without billing you by the hour. Because at LegalZoom, all pricing is given up front. So here's what we want you to do. We want to make sure that you are ready for the future. Start writing your 2018 story at LegalZoom.com right now. And for special savings, be sure to enter the promo code Triangulation in the referral box at checkout. That's LegalZoom, where life meets legal. And again, that's promo code Triangulation for special savings at LegalZoom.com. And we thank LegalZoom for their support of Triangulation. Dorcas, when you think about the special circumstances of what it means to be part of a startup family, part of a startup relationship, an entrepreneur's life and world, what do you think are the 3 or 4 main challenges?
I think uncertainty is a huge challenge of you just never know what's going to happen. You don't know if you're going to have to move to another country next week. You don't know if your significant other is going to even have a job next week. You don't know the hours that they'll need to work, the amount of stress that they'll be under. It's just constantly changing. So that uncertainty, that sense of chaos, it infects the entire family. It's not just the entrepreneur who's experiencing it. Everyone kind of gets pulled into it with them. And related to that, I would say also finances is a huge challenge for entrepreneurs and their families. Obviously, if someone is not getting a paycheck, that's going to affect everybody in the family. Or if they were getting a paycheck and the money dries up, or if they're getting a below market rate salary, or if they don't have benefits, those are all things that really affect spouses and kids as well. And it's hard to make those decisions together as a family to understand what kind of financial risks you're taking on and to weigh how many risks you want to take, how long you want that to go on for, and how are you going to ensure that you can have the revenue that you need in order to just survive as a family. And then specifically from the spouse's perspective, so many entrepreneur spouses deal with resentment because they feel like their lives are just being taken over by their beloved's business. And even if they are very supportive and they love what their partner is doing, it still brings so much extra stress and challenge into their life, and it can affect their own career, their own health, the health of their kids, and so that feels like a lot of sacrifice, and some spouses have trouble with that, especially when it adds on year after year after year, and there's no end in sight of just needing to continue to give things up for the sake of this very unstable business that you have no idea what's going to happen with. It's difficult to ask people to do that.
I definitely want to talk about resentment because that is something that crosses over even the startup world. But let's talk about that first issue, which is risk. And this is big because if you are a serial entrepreneur, if you are a startup person, risk is part of your life. And you did mention early on that that's actually one of the things that makes it fun to start a relationship with a startup person. They will take risks. They tend to be a bit more spontaneous. They like acting on ideas. They like having a lot of ideas. But, and you allude to this in your book, at some point that needs to mature a little bit because it can't always be risk. At some point, if you're establishing a relationship, it means the risk has to decrease, or at least there has to be a part of you, a part of the relationship that's not exposed to the same sort of risk. How do you do that? I mean, as you mentioned, especially if it's a brand new startup person, that risk seems to permeate everything you are and everything you do.
Yeah. Well, I think first off, perspective is really important. When more people get brought into your life, when you now have a significant other, and then when you have kids, how you analyze risk, it needs to change. It can't be something that you're just thinking about for yourself of, can I handle this? Is this going to work for me? Is it worth my personal risk? Because now it is a family risk. So the risks become weightier, and can we as a family manage these risks? And I think it's so important for couples to have these direct conversations together, to ask one another, what are we comfortable with? Finances is a great place to start, because that is a tender spot for a lot of people, and it's something that you can talk about quantitatively. It's very concrete. And so it's important to set limits and to set goals from the very beginning that both partners are comfortable with. How much money are we personally going to invest in this business? What are we comfortable with in terms of credit card debt? How many hours are you able to work where our family won't suffer too much? How much can you travel? What does the other partner need to do in order to bring in some sort of income to support the family? Who's going to help take care of the kids if you are no longer available? And so there are so many more logistics that you just need to work out, decisions that need to be made, and they're decisions that need to be made together. And I think the mistake that some entrepreneurs make is that they get an idea, they're crazy excited about it, and they just barrel ahead. And their spouse, they think that their spouse is just sort of a killjoy, when I feel like the reality is that their spouse is just trying to understand, how is this going to work? And it's actually a really helpful reality check if the entrepreneur is open to hearing that. And sometimes they are, and sometimes they're not. But if the entrepreneur moves ahead without the support and buy-in of the spouse, then that's going to spell a lot of trouble for them as a couple later on down the road. So I think early on, the more that you can agree on and write it down, get it on paper so that both of you can see in black and white what it is that you agreed on, and set timelines and deadlines so that you will revisit those agreements and goals in 3 months, in 6 months, and see how you're both feeling about it. I think it just needs to be much more systematized in terms of what it looks like to weigh risk when you have a family.
It's interesting because in my job, I end up doing a lot of marriage counseling, and people always ask me, what are the biggest concerns? And it's never the concerns that you might think. I mean, yes, kids are there. Yes, there's the whole idea of well, how much relations do you have together? But number one and number two are always finances and how you communicate. And those are so important because they're intertwined. And you bring this up. You bring forward this idea that if you're a startup person, your significant other, your spouse, isn't just your significant other or your spouse. You've made them a business partner. They are involved in this, and they might be financially liable for what you do. So there does need to be that clear path of communications. And as you said, spell it out so that we know, how much time are we giving to this idea? How much will we be personally responsible for the financial blowback of a decision? And when do we move on? Because that's when you start moving into that second thing that you brought up, which is resentment. Tell me about the buildup of resentment with a startup person.
Yeah. Well, when an entrepreneur is in that mode of, this is my life, this is my work's passion, they put everything that they have into it, totally understandably. So they put the best of their time and their energy and their attention. But then what can happen is it can feel like the spouse and the kids get the leftovers. And I personally experienced this. I've been with my husband for almost 20 years. We met as college students, so we were really young. And we had a lot of opportunities to just hang out and spend tons and tons of time together. And then he started this business and he suddenly disappeared. And he wasn't even really around as a roommate anymore. And I felt like I had gone from being, number one in his life to a very, very distant second. And it was like suddenly his first love was his business and it wasn't me. And that's a really painful transition to make. And it just sort of happened without either of us realizing what was going on. So I think that's sort of the beginnings of resentment, is when the spouse or significant other just feels like they're being neglected, that they aren't being paid attention to, that they aren't as valued as they thought that they were, even if that's not the case. I know that Ned has 100% loved me every step of the way, every day that we've been together. But there were just days that I didn't feel that because he wasn't around and he wasn't available for date nights, and he had trouble even paying attention to me when I was right in front of his face. He would still clearly be thinking about the business. So there's that emotional aspect. And then there's the aspect of the responsibilities that fall on the spouse when their entrepreneur is in this mode of taking a lot of risks. So that could be heavier financial responsibilities. So there are some entrepreneur spouses that end up working multiple jobs, or they stay in a job that they hate, or they work when they would rather be at home because the family needs stable income and benefits. And then there are the spouses that have to stay home and be with the kids or care for aging parents, and they take on almost all of that responsibility because their partner is just not available to support them in that. And there's this concept of the lead parent. So if you have kids, even if the two of you are trying really hard to share the parenting load equally, there's always going to be one parent who is listed first on the emergency form, who is the first point of contact for picking the kids up or driving them around or taking them to the doctor. And when you are married to an entrepreneur, you are pretty much guaranteed to be the lead parent because everything's going to fall on you first and foremost, and your spouse is a very distant backup because they're just not around and not going to be as available to help with those things. So I think the combination of the emotional feeling neglected, as well as I have so much extra work and there are all these choices that I feel like I'm being forced into because of the needs of my significant other and his or her business, all those things together can really lead to resentment.
Yeah, and actually in your book, you did talk about going to see a therapist and finding out that, yeah, you were burned out. And I think a lot of this is what played into that, because you're right. I mean, it's not just that your husband was working long hours. It was the fact that along with that came a lack of communication and a decrease of intimacy and this resentment that, well, while you're doing that, while you're chasing your dreams, I have to deal with all the practical aspects of holding this family together.
Right.
It seems to me that that is an issue. Those are issues that every family is going to feel at some point or another. There's always resentments that build up whenever you feel like you're putting more into the relationship than someone else. Mm-hmm. But it would be multiplied tenfold for someone who is a serial entrepreneur, because that idea of moving from one idea to the next, one business to the next, I have to imagine in the back of your mind, you're thinking, here we go again. It's going to be just like it was that last time they started a business. I'm going to be left with a family. I'm going to be left with all the responsibilities. How do you deal with that? I mean, is that something you can communicate, that I can't take another startup, or I can't take a startup right now?
Yes,
what's the
absolutely.
boundaries you draw?
Yeah, well, of course, the boundaries are different for every couple. I think there are some couples that have much higher tolerance for risk together than others do. There are couples where both of them are entrepreneurs, so they totally get it, and they are extremely supportive of one another in that regard. But if you are a person who you're not comfortable with that amount of risk, or you are totally burned out and exhausted from supporting your entrepreneur from however other many businesses that they have already done, then it's really important to speak up, because resentment is not going to help anyone. It's not helping your relationship. It's not going to help you or your partner. And ideally, you want to not get there. And so as much as you can proactively address that from the beginning and say, hey, here's what's been really, really hard for me. And if you're going to do this business again, can we do these things, X, Y, and Z differently? Or is it possible for me to get more help in this regard? Or can you, is there a way to do it so that you are working fewer hours or not traveling quite as much? Or even, I think one thing that I found that's been really interesting is this question of timing. Can you wait until the kids are a little bit older before you pursue your business? Because the timing can make a huge difference. We're always changing, going through different life stages, and having an infant at home versus having teenagers versus being empty nesters, those are completely different life stages, and how it affects your partner if you're going to go out and pursue a business. And so then I think you take all of those things into consideration. And I think the best thing is if you can find some sort of compromise solution of, can you wait until we're in a better place as a family? Or, can you do it in a way that feels less risky, that there's less financial resources on the line for us? And I think those sorts of conversations are essential and will save both partners so much pain down the road if they can deal with it up front.
But there's more to that. And actually, Rev Dan Oreo in our chat room makes a very good point. And I think this is very, very part of being in a relationship with a startup person. You can say that you share the responsibilities and you can say that you share the decisions. But if you ever have party A telling party B that's just the way it has to be, then you're not sharing the responsibilities and you're not sharing the decisions. And it seems to me that sometimes that's what a startup person has to do. A startup person has to say, I know this is bad, but right now we're at a critical time and I have to get this done. What's the secret to get past that? Because those are not compatible. You can't have a relationship where you tell your other, this is just the way it's going to have to be right now.
Yeah, I think that can be a non-starter. So specifically when you're wanting to start a business, and if your partner, if you go through these conversations and you have multiple iterations and you try to work through things and find compromises and they still say, do not do the business, this will be so harmful to me and to our relationship, you need to pay attention to that. I would not recommend any entrepreneur just barrel ahead and keep doing the business without the support of their spouse, because it's going to be actually harder for you to be successful in your business if you have someone who is actively against you rather than being on your team. When you're already in that startup journey and something comes up and you feel like I just have to work, I have to do this right now, then I think it's important to have some parameters around that. It's been really helpful for me when my husband tells me, okay, it's going to be really intense for the next 2 weeks and I'm going to have a lot of extra phone calls. I'm going to be working extra hours. I may need to take this trip. I think you just kind of go into hyper communication mode and you say, this is what's going on. And it's also really helpful to know why. I think sometimes when spouses aren't part of the business formally, we may feel just confused about, why are you so busy? Why is it so hard? What is going on? And if you can explain to your partner, this is why I'm having a hard time right now, or this is why I need to invest extra work, or this is what's at stake for the business, then that actually is really helpful to have that context, to understand, to feel like it's not just random, it's not you choosing to work and be away from family, but this is something that you feel like you need to do, and this is why you feel like you need to do it. And I would say it's essential for the entrepreneur to acknowledge what impact this is having on the family and saying, hey, I know this means that you're going to have to do bedtimes with the kids every night for the next 2 weeks. And I'm really sorry about that. And even just saying that and saying, thank you for being with me in this, that makes a huge, huge difference. And I would also say that it is incumbent upon the spouse to acknowledge when they are feeling resentful, when things are feeling too hard. That means that they also need to do something, either speak up with your partner or find some sort of healthy outlet. Maybe it's a therapist, maybe it's a good friend, or ask for help. If you are overwhelmed with stuff around the house or with juggling your job and your kids, then ask someone to help you out. And because I don't think any of us can do this entrepreneurial journey by ourselves. It is so crazy, even with partners, even when you're in a marriage, in a couple, it's two people can't handle everything. There's just too much work and too much stress, and you need an entire community of people to support you in that.
We like to say that a resentment or a grudge is like swallowing poison and hoping that the other person dies. It builds up, and if you let it, it will just keep building up, and then it explodes. And it may explode at completely the wrong time at the wrong reasons.
Pretty much always the wrong time.
That's how it works. But one of the strategies that you lay out in your book for dealing with this is being very honest about what you want and what you'll need to get there. In fact, you have a little chart that you present of looking at priority. So what is the priority of the thing that I'm looking at doing? What's the goal? And then looking honestly at the resources needed to achieve those goals. And that works for either person in the relationship, the startup person or the non-startup person. So what does that chart look like in your family?
Yeah. So, gosh, well, I think one of the points that I make in the book is that that chart is probably always going to be changing. So, right now, we have a 4-month-old child. And so, for me, taking care of the baby is a huge priority. This book is 2 months old. So, promoting that book is an important priority for me. We recently made the decision as a family to relocate back to Kenya for my husband's job. So, getting our family ready. So we have 2 young kids and a house, and we both have a lot going on professionally. So there's a lot of those details that we need to figure out over the next few months before we move. So I would say for me personally, those are kind of my top 3. And then I need to think about, actually, I need to update my chart because it's a little outdated now, of how much time do I need to invest in each of those things? What financial resources might we need to do an international move, for me to promote my book? And then for my husband, I think, obviously business is at the top of his list all the time. But having a young child at home, he is very much in that stage of trying to figure out, how do I optimize the amount of time that I have at home? How do I make the most of it? How do I get the most done when I am traveling? And as well as, we've had some hard conversations around this upcoming move, because when we've moved in the past, the majority of the logistics have fallen on me, and that's been pretty difficult. And so, we had a 1-hour conversation where we sat down and listed every single thing that needs to happen, or every question that we have that we need to get answered before we can move to Kenya. And then we doled it out. He had his responsibilities, I have my responsibilities. And that has been so helpful for me to feel like he is with me in each step of this, that he wants to be co-parenting with me. He wants to be helping me with the logistics around the house. And it really gives us this shared sense of purpose and mission, even in our day-to-day lives.
Let's talk about that shared sense of mission. One of the points that you did bring up in the book is this idea that you do have to, talking about planning and priorities, you do have to plan to have time to build up that relationship. I can't remember the exact line, but you said something along the lines of time together is not just time that I'm not working. You actually have to put thought into being together. And you've actually come to a pretty good balance of when you have you time, when you have me time, when you have us time. What does that balance look like for your family?
Yeah, well, what I talk about in the book is that we had lived in China. So at the time, we didn't have kids yet. It was just the 2 of us. And I had been working for the company, and I burned out really, really badly. And we realized that part of the challenge was that both of us were completely invested in the work of the business, and we weren't paying any attention to ourselves or our relationship. And so that was a huge wake-up call for us. And that's when we started doing things really differently. And so some of the really key practices that we started then, that we've continued to today, is weekly date nights. I know that is super basic, and everybody talks about it, but when you're married to an entrepreneur, it's actually really hard to make sure that you are having a date night every single week, because their schedule is constantly changing. There's always crises coming up. But what I so appreciate about my husband, Ned, is that over the years, he has learned to schedule that in his calendar, that we are going to have this date night, and he blocks it out. And when we go out, he leaves his phone at home. He doesn't even take it with him, because he knows that the temptation to check email will be too great. And to some extent, he doesn't really want people to be able to reach him, because if the phone rings and he sees that it's one of his colleagues, he's going to be very tempted to answer it, or he's going to start feeling really stressed out if he doesn't answer it. And so to truly honor that time and make it a really important priority. It actually takes work. It feels uncomfortable at first. I think nowadays we're just so used to having our phones on us and with us and looking at them all the time. And so it is an intentional choice.
Well, it's a level of honesty. It's a level of honesty I think most of us aren't used to, of saying, most of us would say, oh, I'll just have my phone on me in case of emergency. Your husband has said, look, if I have the phone, I'm going to let it bother me. I'm going to let it interrupt me because that's who I am and I need to leave it alone. That's an incredibly mature decision I think most of us are not ready to make.
Yeah, well, and it took us some time to get there, and it feels really uncomfortable in the beginning, and you worry, what's going to happen? What am I missing out on? Is someone going to get really upset because I didn't answer their call? And ultimately, it is a choice, and it is understanding that the cost of answering a phone call during date night is actually not worth it, that it's far more costly to the relationship. And if that face-to-face time when my husband and I sit down and we just look one another in the eye and we actually have an hour or 2 hours to focus on one another, that is the fuel that feeds our relationship. And you may know about this, but social scientists have found that if a couple has a really positive conversation, a really good interaction, the positive emotions from that can last for an entire week. So there actually is some science behind why it makes sense to have a date night and why it makes sense to do it on a weekly basis. Because I feel like that's sort of the touch point for our entire relationship.
And that's quantifiable. That's actually neurochemical. If you can measure it when people have a positive relationship experience. It's not just downtime. It's not just doing nothing. It's actually interacting with another person. It changes the way that you approach work and the way that you approach life, which I think is amazing, actually.
Yeah, it actually is really amazing. And it makes you sleep better. Yeah. It makes you healthier. You can think more clearly. I mean, it's pretty remarkable. And I think if we fully understood this, it would be like a no-brainer that if you want to be an effective entrepreneur or in any career, it totally makes sense to have strong relationships and to invest in those relationships and make sure you have people around you who are going to be on your team and be on your side no matter what.
Dorcas, when we come back, I'd love to discuss a couple of other issues that you brought up in your book. The first being milestones. Milestones are very important, especially in the negotiating of the relationship and in looking at how much we will give to what project. But also on this topic of being blindsided, because you do bring it up. What happens when there's just that little extra that's needed, when there's just that little extra that wasn't previously negotiated? Would you be willing to talk about that when we come back?
Sure, yeah, I'd be happy to.
Fantastic. We'll do that in just a second, but first let's go ahead and take another moment to thank a sponsor of this episode of Triangulation. Now, folks, we're talking about being a startup person. We're talking about starting your own business, being an entrepreneur. I did that. I dabbled with that before I entered the priesthood. And I got to say, one of the things I wasn't ready for is to make sure that I got paid. I love doing the work. I'm passionate about what I do. But sending invoices just wasn't my thing. And following up to make sure that I got paid was really not my thing, which is why I'm so happy that we have FreshBooks as a sponsor of Triangulation. Did you know that 44 million people have a second job? And if you're one of them, you've got a side hustle, a passion, a project, a convenient source of extra income. So make sure that you're on the right track with FreshBooks cloud accounting software. Their intuitive dashboard will give you quick access to your spending, outstanding balances, total profit, and other accounting reports. You'll know how you're doing at any given moment, and you'll be ahead of the game during tax season. And with FreshBooks, you can send professional-looking invoices in just seconds. You can save time accepting credit cards online and get paid an average of 2 times faster. Now, no more chasing clients for payments or waiting in line at the bank. You can accept credit cards payments directly from your invoice. You can see what invoices have been sent, viewed, and paid, as well as which ones are overdue and outstanding. You can create proposals with rich text content, images, customizable sections, and more. Now, know what you did and when you did it so that you'll never leave money on the table again. FreshBooks makes it easy to bill for time, by client, and by specific project. And with the FreshBooks app, you can stay connected to your clients and keep tabs on your business no matter where you are. FreshBooks automatically connects to your bank account and updates expenses daily. You can take a picture of a receipt, upload it, and FreshBooks will do the rest. From payment reminders to late fees, automate as much or as little as you'd like to so that you can get back to doing what you love, doing business rather than doing finance. I'll make this year your most productive year yet. With FreshBooks, you'll be ready when tax time comes along, and you'll be set up for success when you decide to turn your passion project into a full-time gig. You can try FreshBooks free for 30 days at freshbooks.com/triangulation. That's freshbooks.com/triangulation. And enter the code triangulation in the How Did You Hear About Us section. Once again, that's freshbooks.com/triangulation. And we thank FreshBooks for their support of Triangulation. Let's get back to the action. Dorcas, one of the issues that you bring up in your book is the importance of milestones. It's too easy to just let the projects pile up and let the next stage and the next stage and the next stage. You need to do something to actually mark milestones, and you need to agree on what those milestones are. What's the process of doing this? I mean, how do you decide what is a milestone and when we will reevaluate and when we will come back to look at this again to see what the next milestone will be?
I think that it is very much related to your conversation around priorities. And so business priorities are very much part of the conversation. Even if your spouse isn't part of the business, it is helpful for them to know what's going on, what you're working on, what your most important projects are. And so then they can have a sense of what's happening and how that will impact the family. And then I think finances are always a critical question to regularly be visiting. Milestones as well around the spouse's career, around what's happening with the kids, around where you want to go, where do you see yourself going as a family, and I would encourage people to not think too far down the road, because the startup journey, there are just too many twists and turns, and so it's good to just think 6 months, 12 months, at the most 2 years down the road. Where do we want to be? So what do we want our family life to look like? Where do we want to live? Do we want to own a house if you don't already? What do we want our quality of life to look like? What would we like our monthly household budget to be? Where are we going to send the kids to school? So those are all types of questions that you can be talking about. And I think it's important to figure out which are the ones that resonate the most with you and that are really, really critical to you. And so those are the ones to start with, and to figure out, okay, what do we want this to look like in 6 months? And then what do we need to get there? What are the steps that we need to take as a family to get there, both on the business side as well as on the personal side? And then to make a commitment to revisit those in, a few months and see, how are we doing? Are we making progress on this? Is this still realistic? Or do we need to change our goals? Or do we need to have totally different goals, throw everything out the window and start over again? Because the startup life, everything is constantly changing and moving. And so you need to make sure that the rest of your life is keeping up with that.
Dorcas, we've been talking mostly about the positive milestones, but I think our audience would consider us to dance around the question if we didn't also talk about some of the potentially negative milestones. You do bring up in your book this idea of, by X date or after X amount of money, we will stop investing personal finances in whatever idea it is that you're working on, which is a way of saying, okay, at some point you have to be ready to pull the plug. And I'm assuming that's probably one of the most difficult conversations you can have with a startup person, because that's their baby, it's their idea, it's their passion, and you're saying, kill the baby. Right? I mean, I don't know. I can't think of a better analogy. This is something that they've poured not just money, but real blood, sweat, and tears into, and they've also poured your relationship into it. And now you're saying, maybe that's time to move on.
Well, this is a shared decision. I definitely don't think that the spouse should be the one who says, hey, I can't take this anymore, just kill your business. It's something that you need to talk about together, and you need to understand where both of you are coming from, what your limits are, and you need to agree on, and usually this conversation comes up when the business is not gaining traction, when it's stagnant, when it's just not clear if it's going to succeed or not. And so to sit down and have that hard conversation of, okay, this is where we're at now, and what is our limit in terms of either time or finances, or kind of just what can we do as a family that and what will be our limit for what we feel like we can invest personally into this business, and that's something that you need to agree on together. I would definitely recommend writing that down, and then when it comes time to it, you just, I think so much of marriage is honoring your agreements, even when it is extraordinarily, extraordinarily painful. And if that is a conversation that you're not able to have or not able to come to some resolution to together, it is totally appropriate to bring in a mediator, to maybe go see a couples counselor or a really good friend, a wise mentor that you both trust, who can help you walk through that and help you understand, how much can we take? At what point is the struggling business going to be such a weight on our family and our marriage that the cost of trying to keep it alive just isn't worth it anymore? I tell the story in my book of this one couple who had reached that point where the business just wasn't working. It was really, really struggling. I think it had been a couple of years. And the wife and husband sat down, and it was the husband who was the entrepreneur. And she told her husband, I think it's not going to work. And I think, we maybe only have a little bit of time left in terms of finances and what we're able to do. And then he agreed. And then she just let him sit with that for about 3 months. And she didn't pester him. She didn't nag him, because she knew how painful it was for him to make that decision to pull the plug. And I really respect that she had the patience and the grace to just step back and give him the space that he needed to mourn this company, as well as to do the practical things that he needed to close it down and think about what he wanted to do next. And so I think that was a very respectful way in which she supported him through what was a really difficult time.
It's interesting that you use that word, to mourn, because that's what it is. You've brought something along into life. You've made something out of nothing, and then either you sell it or it goes away. You do need time to mourn it. And for a serial entrepreneur, that's the heartbreak stage, right? I mean, it's successful or not successful, it's not going to be what it was when you created it.
Yeah. But the hopeful thing is that even if a business doesn't work out, there are so many positive things that can come out of the experience. I mean, entrepreneurs, they learn so much so fast. And so if your business doesn't work out, you can walk away with a dozen new skills, tons of new contacts, more ideas. There are actually things that continue to open up to you. I think some of us fall into the trap of feeling like the business has failed and therefore I'm a failure and I'm doomed. But actually, and especially in a place like Silicon Valley, you get a lot of respect for starting a business, whether or not it works. And so that can lead you on an unexpected path to some new opportunity that you weren't planning on before. And so there are some really wonderful things, which sounds strange, but there are wonderful things that can come out of a failed business. And I think we just need to be willing to see those things and pursue them and support one another and help one another to have that perspective.
I like that you bring that up, because that is actually one of the things that I do like about Silicon Valley culture. There's a lot of things to beat up on it, but you have people here who will just as readily list their business failures as they will their business successes. That's not normal. Normal people like to hide the failures, but here in the Silicon Valley, it's saying, yeah, these are the things I tried and they didn't work, and I can bring these lessons to what I'm doing now.
Absolutely.
That's admirable.
It gives you a lot of credibility, because you did it, you tried it, which a lot of people don't even get to the trying stage. So the fact that you tried it, it says a lot about your character, your perseverance, your courage, and the skills that you bring to bear. And so I think that can be very attractive to a future business partner or a future employer or a future spouse. Those are all excellent traits that you can bring to what you do.
We have Ripple Writer in our chat room who is bringing up an interesting point, essentially saying these things that you're talking about, they sound logical and they're reasonable for reasonable people, but he wonders how many real people can actually do it. Is this something that you can apply beyond the Silicon Valley, or is this really just for people who are married to startup enthusiasts?
Oh, I feel like this is just common sense marriage. And it's more about the question of how do you balance work and marriage? And I think nowadays, so many of us work long hours, whether or not you're an entrepreneur, and you feel the pressure to constantly be checking your phone and checking email at home and be available for meetings or impromptu calls with your colleagues at any time of day. And so I think this is a struggle for everybody. And it can feel like, is this possible? But I've seen it. So I had the opportunity to interview over 70 entrepreneurial couples for this book, and the majority of them had found a way to make it work. Now, the reality is that it can take years to figure this out, to figure out what works for you. So I think one of the challenges is that there's no one-size-fits-all solution, that every couple is different, every family is different, your careers are different, your life stage is different. And so you have to be adapting these strategies to what works for you. And it will feel uncomfortable at first. I think sometimes it can feel like you are sacrificing too much for your family. For the entrepreneur, it may feel like they're putting their business at risk. And those are painful things to overcome. But then when you start to see the benefits, and it can take a little bit of time, at least I would say a few months, to feel like your relationships are changing and deepening and enriching because of the investment that you are putting into them, especially time-wise and communication-wise, I would say, then you start to realize that it's actually worth it, even if it's a little bit harder in the short term. And I think the sad reality is that a lot of people don't start trying to seriously find balance in their life until they burn out, like I did, or they reach a really low point in their relationship or their family life. And my hope is that people can figure out how to proactively live in a more sustainable way before they hit rock bottom, because rock bottom is really, really painful. At the same time, sometimes we need that. And that's the wake up call that you need to realize, I'm not going to live forever. I'm not as invincible as I thought I was. My spouse, needs more than I realized. And I'm going to change the way that I operate because these things are important to me.
It's interesting that you bring up the idea of the rock bottom, because you're right. These are things that people should think about at the beginning, but all too often we don't think about it until we're already down, until we're already burnt out, which is absolutely the wrong time to start having that discussion. Let's talk a little bit about some of the practicals that you bring up in your book. You brought up at one point this situation that you had with your husband Ned, where there was an argument brewing about how much time he spent away. And you thought it was about 40%, and he thought it was about 25%. And so there was a very simple thing that you did, which is he started accounting for every day, where he was, what trips he made. And it's simple things like that where you can actually both have an objective, actual, factual representation of how much time he spends here or away that heads off a lot of arguments. What are the other practicals that you could give to people who are in this situation where they've got a spouse who is always chasing that next dream?
There is an executive coach that I interviewed who used the term opportunity junkies, that entrepreneurs can fall into this trap where they feel like they have to chase after every single thing that comes their way, every shiny object, every possibility. And it's completely understandable, because when you want your baby to survive, you're going to do everything you can to keep it alive. But that's risky, because if you are constantly going after everything around you, there is no margin left in your life for anything else. And so this coach actually recommended that entrepreneurs have somebody who holds them accountable to that. So it could be an executive coach, it could be a mentor, it could be a wise friend, but somebody who helps them evaluate all of these opportunities that are coming their way and helps them see, is this really in line with what makes sense for your business? Does this line up with your priorities? What is the cost going to be if you pursue this? And what will you have to sacrifice? How is this going to impact your family? And those are really hard questions to answer. And I think most of us would have trouble looking in the mirror and trying to figure that out on our own. And so I think if you have someone to bounce those ideas off of who can guide you in that and help you make wise decisions of, is this a business opportunity I should go after or not, then that's really helpful, because most of the time entrepreneurs are flying by the seat of their pants. And so if you can bring in somebody who has some wisdom to bear, some experience, who has seen this before, and they can walk you through that, then I think that is a really, really helpful resource. And I would say also, as much as you can write down. So yeah, we used the spreadsheet to track Ned's travel because we couldn't even agree on how much he was traveling. If you set priorities and make goals as a couple, make sure that you write those down, because all of these things actually build up the commonalities you have. It gives you a starting point for your discussions, because there's a lot of other things flying around. There's a lot of other things that you aren't necessarily going to agree on. But if you can agree on these things that are in black and white, of these are the things that are most important to us, this is the timeline that we're working off of, this is what we agreed our weekly calendar would look like in terms of date night and family night. Those are all things that it helps you to take some arguments off the table because you've already agreed on those things together.
I want to talk a little bit about Endgame here, because what we've been describing is how you cope in a hectic lifestyle. When you have one or both spouses in a relationship doing something that requires a lot of their time, that requires a lot of planned interaction, that requires a lot of agreements in order to keep everything civil, at some point, you can't do it anymore. At some point, even the serial entrepreneur will run out of passion, will run out of energy, will run out of time. So how do you see this playing out? I mean, of course, every couple, every relationship is going to be different, but at some point it needs to mature to a level where maybe you don't need to chase the next serial startup. Maybe you don't need to pour all your energy into the next project. So how does this move into the first decade, the second decade, the fifth decade of being in a relationship with a startup person?
Well, I would say that not all startups are created equal. So that is something to consider, that there are harder startups you can pursue and there are easier ones. Not to say that any are that easy per se, but for example, Ned's business, they make solar powered solutions for families who don't have access to reliable electricity in developing countries. When they started, they were creating a new product category. They were selling in markets where it's very difficult to do business. The regulations are confusing. Corruption can be a challenge. And then they were selling to families who are off grid, and who live in rural areas. So they're very, very difficult to reach. And so not without even realizing it, they had picked an extraordinarily difficult business to pursue because there were just so many unknowns, so many questions, so many things they had to figure out along the way. There are businesses that don't require that much figuring out because someone else has already done it and you think you can do it differently or better. And so you're building upon what's already been done. Or, there are very much lifestyle businesses where people do a business because they love it, but their goal is to just support the family and not necessarily to change the world or to have this, multi-billion-dollar exit. And so that is very valid as well of, I want a business because I love doing this and it's going to make us the income that we need just to pay the bills. And that's great. And so I think over time, with each passing decade, what that startup can look like can really change. And so, Ned himself says that if I ever did this again, it's not going to look the same because I physically cannot do this again. It has been so difficult and so exhausting. And for the entrepreneur who is actually ready to hang up their hat and move on and do something else, that's wonderful. And I think there are many things that you can do that feel entrepreneurial or that allow you to stay in that space without being the founder yourself. You can become an investor. You can work for a consulting firm. You can be an advisor. You can sit on boards of startups. And that's what a lot of people do when they're a little bit later on in their career and they don't quite want to be the person on the front lines doing everything, but they still want to be in that world because it's fun and it's exciting and you can make a huge impact on the world. And I totally get why people would want to stay in that. But those are the kinds of opportunities that it can turn into when somebody gets a little bit older and has more experience.
In so many ways, it just goes back to our earlier conversation about setting those priorities, because that's the answer. The priorities just change as you get older, as you get more mature, as different things become more important to you. Maybe that startup culture just starts to fall a little bit lower on that priority level.
Yeah, very much so. I think that's appropriate.
Dorcas, I want to thank you so very much for giving us your time. This has been an absolute pleasure. If you could, please tell our audience a last bit of advice, a last bit of wisdom, and then, of course, tell us all about where they can find you, where they can find your future writings, especially as you move, where they can keep up with what you're up with.
Yeah, so I would say that for entrepreneurs and their spouses or anybody who just works really hard and has a really demanding career, it can be totally overwhelming to have one more person tell you, and you also need to do all these things to take care of your family or to invest in your relationships. And so I would say that the really hopeful thing is that you don't have to do that much in order to make dramatic changes in how you interact with the people that you love. Small behavior changes make a really big difference. And so if you commit to just, a nightly 10-minute check-in with your significant other before you go to bed, where you're really looking one another in the eyes and you're asking, how was your day? What was good about it? What was hard about it? Or if you commit to a weekly date night or, one family night a week where you're spending time with your kids, those things make a huge difference. And so I would say start small. Start with the one or two things that you feel like you can do now and do those things regularly and commit to it. And I think you will find that that actually really makes a difference. It will make you feel better and healthier and more sane. And it will help your family to feel more loved and more deeply connected to you. And as for me and my writing, you can find me online. I'm at cheng-tozun.com. That's my website. I'm also a columnist for Inc.com. I write about all of these types of issues on a regular basis, how to balance startup life with marriage and family. And so you can find my columns there. I write for Christianity Today. So yeah, you could just Google me. The nice thing about having an unusual name is that I'm the only one. So you can Google me and stuff will come up and it will definitely be me. So I love meeting people. I love hearing from people. And so if you go to my website or find me on Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, please message me and I'd love to chat more about these issues.
We have been speaking with Dorcas Cheng-Tozun, and she is the author of Start, Love, Repeat. It's how to stay in love with your entrepreneur in a crazy startup world. And I would change that to say how to stay in love in a crazy world, period. It's a survival guide. If you are thinking about being in a relationship with someone who is a serial entrepreneur. Dorcas, I want to thank you so very much. This has been nothing but just a giddy pleasure to speak with someone who can give us a new perspective on the Silicon Valley style of life. And I wish you all the best in your future endeavors.
Thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure. I've been so glad to be here.
Thanks to you. And of course, thanks to you, to the people who come back each and every single week to find our new guests on Triangulation. Don't forget that we do this show every Friday, 1500 Pacific time. You can go to live.twit.tv and watch us live. As long as you're watching live, why not jump into our chat room at irc.twit.tv? It's a way that you can interact with the hosts and with the guests. It's one of these things on the interwebs that we just love so much. Also, don't forget you can find the show at twit.tv/try. That's this episode and all of our previous episodes. As long as you're watching, why not subscribe? You can have an audio version, a video version, or a high-definition video version automatically downloaded into your device of choice each week. Never miss out on any of the Triangulation goodness. Also, don't forget that we've got plenty of other shows at twit.tv. If you are into tech, into the tech lifestyle, or if you're just a geek who wants to know what's out there, you can find us at twit.tv or wherever fine podcasts are aggregated. Until next time, I am Father Robert Ballecer, the digital Jesuit. Thanks for listening to Triangulation, and good night.